Recording in progress.
That's a good marker.
Yep.
Zoom tells us to start. Well, this episode's going to be both Loki and high energy. So, haha. Anyway, I've been waiting all morning to use that play on words so everybody can enjoy that. Low key, I get it. There is a lot of data to mine here as I was looking at it, and I know we had also originally talked about the idea of Easter eggs features into what we'll be talking about, as well as kind of some of the psychological elements that we can't help but hit that.
Oh,
right?
gosh, yeah.
And the other thing I noticed too, for anybody, and this is more a commentary on the media part of it, but everything, it seems like everything that is coming up in Marvel in this new phase is going to be linked back to some of the events, right, of Loki. So that's going to be kind of interesting as well to see how does that play in. So
yeah, they planted a lot of really good seeds along the way, and I think that's where some of the Easter eggs and some other things come in.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's your as far as when we approach this? I don't know. There's various different ways we can start, but one of the ones that I thought I'd get off the bat is some of the chatter that I saw online when this was when it was coming out, was some people were very uncomfortable with Loki being at all redeemed, particularly because this is the Loki who just barely committed like a genocidal attack on, or not genocidal, I should say, mass murdery attack on New York City.
Yeah.
And so, and I'm not really, I wasn't bothered by it. So I was almost a little surprised to see that. But anyway, but what do we feel of like a redemption arc? I mean, Tom Hiddleston is so beloved in this role that nobody cares what he's done.
Well, and I think that's an interesting thing because he is, like, again, in a sense, the favorite villain. And the idea that, okay, so do they not like the redemption arc because it doesn't make him a villain anymore? And then at the same time, I sit there and I go, well, how much was he really a villain and how much was he an anti-hero? And I think that's the other part is that sometimes we confuse those two, or they get conflated, they get mixed up. And, when you stop and think about it, and that's, I think one of the things that I loved was right in the very first episode where Mobius says to him, because he's giving it the whole, I don't belong here, I'm the god of mischief. And Mobius calls him, I'm like, well, what do you do that's really like mischievous? Like how mischievous is it really? Like, yes, you're doing certain kinds of things, but you're kind of like throwing this title around and all of this arrogance, but you're just kind of, in some cases you just using people, or you're this or you're that, or how, like, compared to other stuff, what is it really? And he kind of calls him on his reputation. And honestly, like for me, so much of it was the idea of the redemption arc. It was in that shorter period. So it wasn't like, Tony Stark's over the course of, how many movies you see the little nods, but was this idea, again, it's the whole hurt people. So Loki is the way he is because he's he's the younger adopted child, There's all of this stuff that he didn't know. He's, and so he feels so entitled to different things that he feels been taken away from him that he acts out. And then he uses his I'm mischievous. So, I'm the god of mischief is, kind of like his validation for it.
And I know that I think we touched on this another time we were talking, but there is the big element of when there's someone who's a powerful, god, monster, superhero, whatever. The idea that, and this has been alive in the comics for a long time, when someone is the anti-hero, when they're more anti than hero, people maybe they do a lot of really bad stuff because they have the power to. It's not like, oh, I went off on my own bad issues and maybe got a DUI or maybe, caused relationship hurt to someone. It's more like, oh, I killed a planet. Now, I mean, I know if it was real life, right? But it's like a more sweeping mistake. And then they're still around, and what are they going to do? That might be dismissive, but we're okay with it when it comes to Tony Stark being a weapons manufacturer and getting sort of child soldiering Spider-Man a little bit. And we're okay with him having the redemptive arc when he was pretty horrible and led to deaths. His choices led to deaths, certainly when he was presiding over that. Or Odin in Ragnarok, we learned that here's Loki's adopted father who has a secret past as a terrible conqueror person.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and that Hela was by his side, you know.
Yeah.
And it's
So
like, you know, where you suddenly look at the family and you go like, oh, again, the whole like, okay, wait a second, Thor's the outcast here. He's the one that doesn't fit in. Like he's just the, you know. But well, no, and I think that's the thing too, is like with Loki. I mean, so much of it, and that's where to me the good storytelling comes in, is that it's you see that he's in some respects the product of his environment, and that's where I loved what they did in the what ifs to show what could have happened, you know, alternatives. But for me, the redemption arc was always there because, I mean, that's part of the reason why he's lovable, because there is still that thing about him that for some reason you still connect to. It's not like, you know, nobody sits there and goes, well, gee, if only Thanos was given a chance. And I was like, you know, again, the what if took it and kind of, you know, threw it in a different light. But it's still that thing where you're like, okay, yes, they're doing this thing and they're making it funny or they're doing it differently, but people are still sitting there at the cocktail party going, but dude, it's genocide. But dude, it's like, you know, like it's the, you know, they've giving you that other opportunity and like the what if. Whereas Loki, there is always that, you know, in some respects, he's the bratty little brother trying to get attention and is worried that, you know, dad doesn't like him as much and all these other kinds of things. So he's, you know, in perpetual temper tantrum mode. He's, you know, kind of developmentally frozen at a particular age, or it doesn't matter how many millennia old he is. He's still like, and I'm going to have my 7-year-old temper tantrum because dad likes Thor better.
And the other part too is I think that sometimes nuance is difficult, right? So we oftentimes don't like a character. Well, let's put it this way: does a protagonist of a series do they have to do the right thing all the time?
Yeah.
And it's like, not really. And when it reminds me in a way of when Cruella came out, another media piece that I absolutely loved. But you look at that and I saw a lot of people saying, oh, we're making Cruella relatable. And it's like, well, yeah, relatable, but she's not a good guy. And I think in Loki, he's never really a good guy ultimately, although he does good guy things sometimes. He's more this chaotic, neutral, which is as my son who's more into D&D has assured me, chaotic neutral is the most annoying character to deal with, and also hard to go, oh yeah, this is a crime versus crime story in the case of Cruella, or it's like this is a, you know, bad versus worse antagonist protagonist, or this is so, you know, Loki, we're seeing like, do we care that, you know, I've seen people, oh, I don't care if he falls in love. What does he have the right to fall in love? It's like, well, everybody has, you know, has an inherent ability to love or be loved. And so what do we do? And so ultimately it's just, you know, he's that character. A lot of what he does in Loki is selfishly motivated. Right.
Oh, yeah. And it is neutral in the sense that it's all about him. It's what works for him in this circumstance for the long run. And again, that was the other part that I liked about the dynamic that he had with Mobius, because Mobius was kind of calling him on stuff. It was the whole, okay, so, you know, what were you doing in New York? Well, I'm trying to take it over. It's basically, I want to rule Midgard. Then I want to go after, you know, the other 9 realms. It's like, okay, so you just want to be like the leader of everything. And then what? And it was just like, well, I'm just going to be the leader of everything.
And so, and
there was that weird kind of like, I just want to be in charge. I just want to be the boss.
Yeah.
As opposed to, you know, and again, this is sort of go off on another tangent, but I think about the kind of the stuff that happens in Dune. And when you go through that thread with, you know, Leto with Paul, and then with Leto the second and, you know, other characters there, you see they have this, and again, it may be delusional, but they have at least a sense of what they're going to do with their leadership, and they think it's good.
Yeah.
So they may be, you know, they may perceive themselves as chaotic good now, or even lawful good, but the implications that they have. Whereas Loki, you know, and they're trying to project out over long periods of time. Whereas Loki is just, well, I want to do the thing and I want to be in charge because I'm tired of not being in charge. I was supposed to be, you know, in charge here, or I was supposed to be in charge there, or I could do this better than so and so. But the part that's funny is that in a sense he has no vision, and he just wants to.
And there's an element which, and in fact, just like many other characters, right? The greatest villains don't look at themselves as villains. And what I believe it's even in the first Avengers where he talks about the burden of freedom on people. Yes. Won't you be happy to be relieved of that freedom because I'll be in charge?
But you see, but that's the part that I found interesting, was that running thread,
Mm-hmm.
because his whole issue within being within the TVA is that he doesn't have freedom and you can't hold me back. So it's this weird thing where it's like, I'm going to organize your world and I'm going to be in charge and everything's fine.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, you realize that that totally counters what you're actually going through right now, and how it's like I make my own path and I do this and I do that. And you can't tell me that this was, predetermined, or, well, and again, even that again, the opening part there, where it's the whole, hey, wait a minute, what about the Avengers? You give me a task force and a team and I'll go get them. And because they've been totally messing with the timeline. It's like, oh, no, that we expected that. And it's like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah. No, and
I
that,
take the
right.
Tesseract and jump into the Gobi Desert and I'm all suddenly in shit, but you're like, they were doing what? And it's okay. So again, it's that whole, he just, one more example of being indignant. But like you say, the freedom thing, he has this real problem with the notion that his life or anything, this whole timeline predetermined, etc. But his whole goal is, well, I'm just going to be the boss of everybody because it'll make your lives easier.
There's that, you see that elitism, which I guess we should say with wealthy prince, probably not surprising, but there's the elitism of saying, I can make decisions. I should be free.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of you were just born normal and that's your crime. So I'll take over from here. And I think we see that reflected. And once again, we're okay with it when it's Downton Abbey, where we kind of are on their side that they're in charge. Not totally, but we are a little.
Yeah.
And so anyway, it's an interesting thing to see. One of the parts we've already touched on that it might be good to focus on is, I thought it was amazing how the whole first episode, and it's sprinkled throughout, but the whole first episode was essentially a therapy session with Mobius and Loki, right? It's like an aggressive therapy session to be like, okay, here's how you are. What do you really want? What is it you're really trying to flash into a bad Owen Wilson impression here? But and I thought that was fascinating that we're right away attacking and at the same time touching on a lot of the comic lore as well as the movie lore, and saying here's how you play out in all these ways, but essentially getting to the roots of his own psychology, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that I've liked about some of these, and again, we talked about it with Falcon and Winter Soldier and with WandaVision is that they've had these opportunities to go deep. And so you're not missing out on action or anything, but it's allowing, again, that reflection and these little, again, in different ways. I mean, some cases it was actual therapy, with Bucky, but these little things where they get to do these and they're not just here's a series of flashback things done in some kind of, way that doesn't forward the story. And like I said, I think it was really interesting in terms of, again, Mobius's character development as well, because they were these foils for each other. And it was the kind of dynamic that, nobody else could call Loki on these other things that he's engaged with before, because it's not like he and Thor are going to have that kind of conversation.
Right.
That's just, they're not going to sit down over beers and sort their stuff out. There's always going to be, some sort of friction there. And even when they have tried to do stuff, again, there's always, that friction or something else or snide comments, whatever. Or what's the, get help, that there's their big moment of bonding. Get help. I don't like get help.
Well, and you see those elements too of that existence of a relationship, because we see in the show, he does a reflection on where it is really, it was done for different reasons, for laughs partially, but where Loki was actually DB Cooper, which people, whether they realize or not, and some, I noticed with my son had read about DB Cooper. My daughter hadn't. And it was like, it was a real thing. But in this case, he says basically he was pressured into it because he lost a bet with Thor. So there's some indication that it's like, oh, we've had these good times too. And I don't know what bet leads to having to hijack a plane, but, and a very safe crime for them to pick for him, because apparently, because in the reality, nobody got hurt, and it was like this little charming wink to the, to everybody.
It was a nod to the real world kind of thing. So no, it was Well, but and that's the thing that I liked, that they would have, like, again, to me, that was, again, one of, we say, an Easter egg of sorts, in the sense that it's a nod to the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they did do the psychology, and even just the different things, like, for example, like when they go back to Pompeii and how he sits there, and again, the little monologue that he has is it's all going sideways as they test the theory about the other variant. And I guess that was the other part too that I liked, was the way the way they used Owen Wilson's character, to kind of come in and go, well, like, I'm in a sense, I'm studying him. I need to know how a Loki thinks to catch what I believe is another Loki variant. And then that even goes into the whole idea, which I really loved how they pursued, because it gave you the opportunity to, again, have all the nods back to what happened in all the variations that there have been in the comics, and those kinds of things. So you again drop the multiverse thing. Okay, this is what happens when you go off and these different things. But it was the idea of him having to reflect on, oh, wait a second, other versions of me, which, again, while it was done as variants, are really just different aspects of personality. And so for me, what a lot of this was it was the literally the many sides of Loki, and the idea that we all actually have different versions of ourselves, in the sense that, and again, it's not like, this is not talking about a dissociative identity disorder. And, it's more about there's your work, how you act at work versus what you, do at, with maybe your community soccer group versus, there's just different, we tend to compartmentalize ourselves. And I mean, part of that's just functioning,
That's the thing, is there's a healthy aspect to that if we couldn't do it at all, we couldn't hold a job. Right?
Yeah.
If we couldn't do it all, we probably couldn't have friendships and relationships, or we couldn't go to a funeral because we would act just the same as if we were with our friends, or we'd be so repressed other times. If we were just, one way all the time, we all edit, what we express at various times, and that's healthy, right? There's a healthiness. And then there's a sickness or illness to it as well, which was very interesting when we see the classic Loki in the ridiculous old comic book outfit with the horns and everything. After they run into, once again, the different aspects, right? Because they're in their hiding place, and in come the other Lokis and other whatever, and they're like, we're going to take over. And they're like, take over what? We don't have anything, and it's like, no, we're still going to take over. And which goes to Mobius's point. You don't even care what you're ruling. You just want to rule.
Exactly.
And then they get out of that situation, and there's, I think, just very interesting dialogue that you hear where classic Loki says, we're sick. There's a sickness in Lokis, right? And then Kid Loki says, and whenever we try to change, we get pruned, right? Whenever we try to change, that means we're breaking the timeline, and the TVA shows up and gets us. And so it's like, we can be sick, but we can't be healthy. And there's a real feeling of, I'm not allowed to be healthy, not allowed to change.
Exactly. And that's what I thought was really interesting, because it is this idea that, okay, so hold on. In a sense, the reason why, I mean, again, we've enjoyed him and all of these things, but you suddenly get into this place, especially when Mobius starts asking those questions. And then this stuff comes up later where you go, oh my gosh, in some respects, yeah, he's been limited to who he can be. And he's, in a sense, bought into it because, well, he's the god of mischief. He's this and that. And so there's literally just, again, we love him, but you suddenly go, wait a second, has he been more one-dimensional than we realized, and more than he's realized? That he's been playing this role, thinking it's this rich, wonderful, I'm in charge of everything kind of thing. And how often do we get caught into that, where some aspect of our lives keeps us pinned into something? So is it based on a family dynamic? So I'm the blah, 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 blah in the family. Either am I the I was the kid that, did well in school. So therefore I'm forever the nerd that has to do well, and God forbid I fail. Or am I the kid that, because I did well in sports, I've been painted, as the dumb jock. And therefore, the fact that I want to go and do a master's degree, everybody in the family gives me side eye and, ha, ha, ha. But that thing where you're, expected to play a role, and God forbid you try to leave it, or again, toxic family environment, and you try to leave the toxic sandbox, and everybody just flinging sand in the cat poo that's, in the public sandbox. Like it's that kind of thing where you realize it's like, oh, wait a second. That nexus and that the pruning of the timeline can be like any of those sorts of things. And what does that say about any of us? Or what, like to me, that was one of those, it's Loki's and Loki variants, but that's kind of a universal truth or something that most of us experience at some point where, wait a second, one version of me is the version that, I'm expected to be 24/7. And I'm not allowed to be anything else. So when he sits there and goes, I'm supposed to be the ruler of everything and be this and be that. And you're like, okay, well, how much of that is just because that's, again, maybe one aspect of him, but then that's all he was allowed to be. And then there were just these, again, different timelines, different whatever, where I'm Loki, I'm the god of mischief. And if I'm doing it in weird, bad tights,
Exactly. Or as an alligator, whatever. I don't know if the alligator ever overthrew anyone, but, and once again, you've got that everyman element where Owen Wilson's like, why is one of you an alligator? That doesn't make any sense. But which is fun, of course. But it's interesting how we see, and you can see this. I'm going to bring in a little bit of Ragnarok here and say, let's take the elevator ride with Thor, and Thor is at this point kind of saying, hey, we're reaching out. We could be a thing that, as brothers. And he says, but then he says, but you should stay here. You really should stay here because you're going to lie and murder your way to the top. And you could do well here. And it's like, so there's Thor pushing the role that Loki plays. And then we see Loki tries to betray him again, right then, which is then Loki reinforcing his own status in that role. And you see that just like you're talking about, where on the one hand, maybe we're trapped by expectations, but then we maybe feed into that and say, well, I'm trapped by expectations. I might as well play the role. Yeah,
right. If you're going to paint me into this corner, I might as well, at least pick the color of paint.
Yes, that's a great way to say it. It reminds me of Salvador Minuchin, who's one of the pioneers of family therapy, and he's written all these different books. One of my favorite phrases, he talks about using techniques to help other people, and he said techniques only work if you learn them well enough that you forget you know them, and they just become part of you. So that's one of my favorite concepts in being a helper person. But he one of the things he would do is he liked to do therapy with the whole family and say, oh, someone brings in their kid and say, my kid misbehaves. And he said, okay, so you need therapy to handle a kid who misbehaves. No, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant, So he would take that approach of saying, what's broken in your family system? And almost always there's a scapegoat person who's like, well, what's broken is dad, mom, kid, whoever. And he would attack that. And it was interesting because he usually would do one of two things. He would either say, no, you're not. It's like, oh, well, the problem here is that this person is fill in the blank. And he'd say, no, they're not. What? Yeah, they are. They did this last week. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that. And he would challenge it up front. The other thing he would do that was interesting is sometimes, depending on the family, he would go the other route and say, oh, wow. Like he tells a story of a family that was multi-generational, and they came in and their mom or grandma was, so sickly and she can't do anything. And but we're frustrated and resentful, and she's, all these things. And so he really started pouring into this concept of saying, I know you just can't, you're probably doing too much. Just like they said, you're not able to do anything. And boy, you want to take a trip? You shouldn't do that. No, you should just probably. And did you go to the store the other day? You said as you were talking, you probably shouldn't do that. You should send them to the store. You probably enough that he provoked a resentment in her to say, well, I'm not that bad. And then he'd flip it and say, you're right. You're not that bad. In fact, how bad are you really? There's part of you that knows you can do more and that you can be empowered, right? Yeah. And so it's interesting to see how attacking these roles is key to health, right? And saying, let me try to redefine myself and who I am. And to do so, and this, maybe I'm reaching, I don't know if they meant it this way, but to surround Loki with these kind of like fan service Easter eggs, fun. Yeah. Oh, I just whacked into my microphone there, so apologies to anyone especially because I'll totally forget to edit it out. But that's my role. I'm trapped in, so I'm not going to try to fix that. So, but to say also surrounded by all of these little hallmarks of pieces of the universe and alternate realities, to say, wow, there's a lot that can be different, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot that can be changed. If Thanos can rob a bank with a helicopter in one reality and destroy reality in another reality, well, gee, maybe I should be different. Maybe I could challenge, what
Yeah.
am I willing to do, selfishness or selflessness wise?
Yeah. Well, and that's what I love too about his relationship with Sylvie. And there was a whole other thing there where, I mean, and again, people toyed with, okay, the nods, the enchantress, and all these other different things. But I mean, what I really loved was that, yeah, obviously they gave her a different name. In the sense that, you're going to have Loki, Lady Loki, whatever kind of thing that they, so it's the idea that she is differentiated on one level. And then at the same time, it's like, oh, that the proverbial, like, you'd see these two and they're literally arguing into a mirror,
Yes, exactly.
And that was just this brilliant thing where it's like, you're so this, and it's like, well, and you're not recognizing, again, you're seeing it as the viewer, but they're not seeing it as like you're accusing somebody of something that you are doing exactly the same, but apparently you don't think you are. And it was that. So that's what I loved, was the fact that they were a mirror to each other, and that I loved, again, the other ones being brought in so that it fleshed it out more, but the idea of the two of them as this running thread, because, and the fact that and again, people got into the whole, again, all the issues around gender there, because you see that it's noted that, on his paperwork in one of those shots, it's like, fluid is put there. So it's the idea that that's going to be fluid. And again, maybe slightly more, fixed in one area in one reality than another potentially, but the idea that that's there. And so what grows between them as a relationship, I thought was you talk about, is he entitled to a relationship in love? And it's also, but it was again, because this is another manifestation of himself, it's the idea of self-love, that one of the things that you kind of come to realize is that not only is he bought into a role, as again gets kind of explained to us the way through, but it's the idea that there's a certain element of self-loathing, or if not self-loathing, at least self-doubt and a lack of confidence that gets then, that's almost the source of the bombast of, you being burdened with glorious purpose and the, God of mischief and all this kind of, the pomposity is, that overinflation, that puffing up so that nobody sees this other stuff. And then in some respects, you've got Mobius and Sylvie, who are in a way, and some of the other characters in a lesser way, calling him on his crap and calling him on his. So, I mean, I love that. And so, and again, people got into the weird, like, okay, is this creepy because he's a variant of himself, or all these other things. I'm like, just like, you know what? Like,
well, and as a matter of fact,
the idea that this is about self-love in a way.
It's actually really interesting. And I hadn't really clued in, like when you talk about it, with the self-love aspect, one of the things that I hadn't put these two together in my head, right? But they say that narcissism at its root is self-loathing, right? And that it's a house of cards we build around the self-loathing, and the house of cards looks fantastic. Isn't that cool? I can make a house of cards, but don't touch it. Don't knock it down. I'll kill you. I'll kill you if you try to. And it's like, whoa, that got ugly really quick. And those narcissistic actions are so ugly and so toxic that we forget that deep down there's this self-loathing. And you've got Mobius at first saying, like, you're in love with yourself. Well, that just makes sense, doesn't it? Because you're the ultimate narcissist. And then we have examples of, like, the moment with the blanket of, like, boy, I can make a blanket and we don't really need one anyway. And it's like, I don't know how to relate to myself and to love this other person, which in the way. So that's like, you have both the examples of a sick self-love, narcissism, versus the healing self-love, which is actual acceptance, love, being able to be there. And I would say ultimately in the end, one of the problems is that there's the lack of trust. How does he put it? You can't trust me because I'm not trustworthy, and I can't trust you, right? Because I don't trust, because my trust is broken. Sort of like my internal trustability isn't there. I'm sure that was just the most concise way I could have said that. Probably exact quote. No, I was a little bit more snappy in the thing. And so there's that limit of trust. You can't you can love without trust, but you
Mhm.
can't express the love the same way without trust, right? Because it's not safe. And I think
Mhm.
that's ultimately where they have separation and distinctness in their behaviors is the damage to the self-love, because they both go into their agendas, which is
Yeah.
the unhealthy self-love, right? And she's like, no, I got to kill this guy. And he's like, no, we got to take over. And it's like
Yeah.
both of those in a way could be seen as the unhealthy selfish love of like, I got to
Yeah.
do what I got
Yeah.
to do.
Exactly. I've got the
Yeah.
answer. You're wrong.
Yeah, yeah. And I hadn't tied that together until you were saying that with
Oh,
the
cool.
self-love aspect. So that's interesting. Just
Well, and that for me, how I looked at it was it took him having to see again these variants, these external manifestations of himself,
yeah.
and again maybe not necessarily acknowledging, because I mean that there was a reflection, and they were, because that was again one of their things is the, well, you can't be me and I can't be you kind of thing, and this is you're at best you're a pale knockoff of me kind of thing, or you're whatever, again however they would.
Which of us is a copy off the other, right? There's that
Yeah,
kind of
exactly.
face off they have on the train where it's
Yeah.
like, meh, you're me. Nah, you're me. That's the
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that I'm the original version, and that as being a copy, in the same way that, you run something through the photocopier, it's not as, it doesn't matter how good the copier is, right? It's not the same. And so that was that whole thing. And I think it was really interesting because while that was an ongoing thread, it went right through to those trust issues, that as much as they started to both see, feel, and respond a certain way, and gained at least some level or beginning to, address notions of self-love and self-acceptance, there was always those things that would, one of them would literally trigger the other and bring it back to, no trust, no whatever, going to get back into my little house of cards where I'm the king of the world, or where I should be the king of the world, and I'm going to do my thing. So no, I think it was, like I said, I loved it as a series, and I thought they tackled so many things that I found sometimes when I was, again, like you're talking about, like what you find on the internet, I'm like, okay, you know what, other people are getting caught up in this other stuff, and I feel like they're missing a layer. Now maybe that's just overthinking me, and the fact that because the other part that, in terms of like my program, I use Loki to talk about when we live with multiple diagnoses, and the idea that these are all each a part of us, but are we in a healthy place? Are things feeding off and flaring is my anxiety triggering something depressive? Is my ADHD? And it's again, you're all the same person in some respect. And so that's how I looked at it, was and what happens when you get them all in a room?
Yeah.
A crocodile bites off or alligator bites off somebody's hand, like it was just, but so that's how I look at that, is that Loki represented that for me, was the idea that, you can have these variations. They're all you, but they're all you in a different context. And that even goes to, again, even from a non-diagnosis perspective, that idea of the roles again, that each of them was playing a role in whatever their reality was. And similar, but different. So it's that way of, to me, there's just layers and layers and layers.
Oh, no. And it's fascinating, too, to look at the different forms of evolution. You've got, I think the kid Loki character expresses this idea of regret. He's like, he killed Thor, right? He accomplished his goal of killing Thor and didn't seem to like it very much. And then you have the great act of self-sacrifice, literal self-sacrifice by old classic Loki.
Yeah.
And one of the things that that came from would be his years and years and years of self-isolation, right? Of being like, I needed to, and it's fascinating again to say his fix, his cure for his own narcissistic and destructive tendencies was, I can't be around people because I'm not safe, right? He's like, I have to be here. And then it was when he dared to want to re-engage that, of course, that he wasn't allowed to get better that way. But to be ultimately, he had rejected weaponry in a way, which, not that he didn't, mess around with people or hurt people at all. But at that point it was like, no, you don't need to be carrying knives and stuff. And and also accessing this idea that you are more powerful than I'm going to manifest a whole, and in a way, here's a symbolism of like, he's going to create his home. He's going to create Asgard and, and say, I have access to it and I'm giving up my own self to say, and that's where he really ties into an actual glorious purpose, which is I'm going to die for this part of myself to live on and for the greater good of the universe and the timeline. Hopefully, we don't really know, whatever. That gets into that. But to say for a bigger reason than myself, and that came from years and years of self-introspection, right?
Yeah, that he literally sat there at the end of the universe, going, this is where I'm safe.
And, there's a couple of different forms of therapy that when you get into it, let's say neurolinguistic programming is one, and also what they call internal family systems, which is when you set up and have your own emotional parts talk to each other or you confront. Gestalt does a little of this. And essentially what I'm trying to say is there's a approach that says that, in a sense, artificial, you could call it, or you could call it imagined. I mean, I think it's the proponents of those theories would say it's much deeper than that. But to say I'm going to sit here with an emotional part of me, or I'm going to do an empty chair discussion with a loved one who isn't really accessible to me emotionally, or maybe, they're dead or something. And so you could say it's a simulated change. And I guess I'm bringing that in to say if I'm Loki and if I'm in his shoes of the prime Loki in this series, I can watch that Loki and his growth and his experience. And do I take that part and say, oh, I learned that. I learned from that. And now I have benefited from this alternate timeline, literally in that case. But in therapy, sometimes we're trying to do an alternate timeline of what did my younger, less experienced, abused self need? And can I picture myself going back in time and giving that confidence and acceptance and support? And do I benefit internally in some ways as if I actually had that?
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
We talk about how you need to reparent your inner child kind of thing and give them, what's the things that you would give them, what were you missing and what were you, having those conversations and that. So no, I think that was the one thing that this did was in so many ways it played out. And again, I don't think anybody was sitting there with, I'm not expecting the writers to be sitting down with a selection of different, okay, well, hold on, let me pick up the Gestalt textbook and, whatever.
Right.
And that kind of stuff. But there was this wonderful thing that my family and I did in therapy. Hold on, we need that in episode 3. I don't think they were doing that, explicitly, but it's interesting because they played out those kinds of parallels that were in there. And you're like, okay, that's a snippet. Or like you say, he got to play out those conversations, those things. It's just that rather than talking to an empty chair, maybe he's talking to Sylvie, or maybe he's talking you saw it played out differently. And that in a sense it got, I don't want to say lost, but there was like a camouflage over it in the sense that it was played out with certain kinds of characters where you're like, oh, wait a second, hold on. You peel that layer back and that's really so-and-so is in the role of this and that. And that's even where I think it was interesting watching them challenge themselves on their roles. So it was interesting to see sort of like the initial therapy session, with Mobius there in that first episode, the sort of what I'd call like the parallel peer support kind of therapy stuff that we saw with Sylvie and Loki. And then it's like, oh, and look at it. Now we have the family session towards the end as the other Lokis come in. Okay. Everybody's going to sit down and they're all going to talk about, And which again, when you think about it, they're the same but different. So in the same ways, there's that element of the shared within the family, right? And they talk about their roles and that whole idea. Well, you say that I'm the blah 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 within the family, but instead they're self-identifying. Well, I'm the such and such, and no, actually you're this and that. So it was, again, different characters within the same family, but at the same time, different characters from different variations. So like I said, it was really interesting. Like there's part of me that wonders, how many of the writing staff have got their undergrads in psych or something like that,
or have been through maybe their own, right? Have been through their own kind of therapy experiences too, right?
Yeah.
And of course, Richard Grant, I think is his name, right? Let's see. Yeah. Who played classic Loki. And if you're like me and have at all a guilty pleasure of the movie Hudson Hawk, if anyone hasn't seen that, go back and see how crazy he can act. So,
With Nail and I is awesome.
Okay, yeah, that he really. That's
how old I am.
So I wanted to hit, and I don't know if we'll get anything meaningful from this other than it was cool, but particularly in the limbo end of the universe land after they get pruned, all the things that are there, right? So because you've got, for example, New York Avengers Tower. I didn't realize till I was like doing some rewatching or doing some actually reading up on the Easter eggs that Stark Tower is there destroyed, but it says Kang on Stark Tower, which goes back to some of the comics where Kang Industries purchased Stark Tower and was a rival. And it turned out, of course, it was run by Kang the Conqueror, who is coming up at some point, or might even be the guy who was the guy in this one. But we also saw
I remember like the Thanos helicopter and stuff.
Yes,
that was the other thing, and I haven't had the chance to do it. Is to literally do the whole okay. I'm going to stop on this frame. I'm going to stop on that frame because we found ourselves starting to do it a little bit with the closing credits and seeing different like the posters and the paperwork. And
yes.
So that's still on the to-do list.
you had mentioned something I think is really important to the character development, which is we learned that with both sexual orientation and identity, right, which are very different, that there's a fluidity there. That Loki, because he's a shapeshifter, he's been Lady Loki. He can and then when they're talking on the train, and she's like, "You got a prince or a princess or whoever that you," and he's like, "Some of both," And there's a bisexuality as well, which there's an inclusivity there, but also. Just kind of showing more of who the character is as a person.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's something too that often gets forgotten about. Like as much as Marvel has, changed things from the traditional Norse mythology in terms of, the idea of Thor and Loki as siblings rather than Loki as a blood brother to Odin. There's been little things like that, but there's so much of it that is really true to the character. And that was in there. And so, I think it's interesting because again, that's something that's millennia old. Yeah. And of all the things, now again, how much has it been brought to the surface at different times and places based on, again, larger social, circumstances. And so I think it's brilliant as well, because it is one of those things where there's, the comic book world has really, again, as a reflection of larger society, even if it's sometimes seen as this thing off to the side and quirky, has still reflected a lot of gender roles and gender stereotypes. So, Loki is this, again, how they put that on there, how they did the variants, again, Sylvie's role, all those kinds of things. It was a really nice way of doing it in the sense that it's true to the character, both in Norse mythology and whatever. And it's not necessarily an aspect that is put out there a lot, nor does it have to be like front and center in some weird, like aggressive way, but it was just it's a thing.
Yeah.
And he moves on.
So we also saw, let's see, and I had to go back and read and watch some YouTube videos to get some of these, but Yellow Jacket's helmet and a huge version of Yellow Jacket's helmet was on the ground. As if it was, enhanced or grown. Red Skull's plane. There was a helicarrier there.
I remember the helicarrier, yeah.
There was a statue of a character that was called like the Living Tribunal. I didn't know that character, but that was one that was there. And of course, you mentioned the Thanos copter, and I'd written down it was from the old Spidey Stories number 39 is what they plugged it as.
Yeah, like it's really it's an old one. Like I remember seeing the pictures of it, and you're just like, wow, that's like the old school like style.
Right. Yeah, that Thanos would have a helicopter around, and he was, I believe, the story I read up on, it's kind of become infamous of like a silly thing. In fact, it even appeared in a Deadpool comic making fun of, because
like Thanos is this powerful titan, and he requires a yellow helicopter,
and it says Thanos on the side. And there's a panel that's become a famous meme where it just shows him landing and going like, "Hey Deadpool, it's me, Thanos." So not Josh Brolin's version.
Yeah.
At least not yet. And of course, one of the favorites is Frog Thor, right? As the camera pans down underground when they're going into their bunker, there is a jar containing a frog with Thor clothes that is hopping and trying to get a hold of a Mjolnir that's also buried next to it. And that's also a comic reference that Thor turned into a frog at some point, and they liked it. It was so popular, they created a character named Throg, who is someone else that became a frog, and a splinter of Mjolnir became its own little hammer. So he's got his own little hammer. So
Yeah.
just kind of silly and fun little things. Once again, going to those
Well,
alternate timelines.
but I think that's the other part that I like about what the Marvel universe has been doing, is that when you stop and think about, like, again, even at I call it like the most basic level of like set decoration and whatnot,
Yeah.
is and costuming and these things. It's like, if you've got these opportunities, like, why not? Like, if you've got to have stuff on the back wall or something here or whatever, like, it's that opportunity when you know that because of the richness of the canon and the catalog, that you can't do everything. Then you throw in these Easter eggs because it is a way of, okay, at least, a nod.
Yeah.
And then you never know if it becomes that thing that somebody riffs off later on. So I think that's the other part that I love about a lot of the Easter eggs, is that you don't know how much of that was, hey, this is just a fun thing. Let's put it out there and see if anybody notices. But it is maybe intended to do something else later, or it's not, and somebody else is organically going to, you remember that scene where, okay, I'd love to do blah, blah, and then they pitch an idea, and the next thing you know, and I guess that's what I love, is the fact that it's there. If you're not somebody that's familiar with all of those things, or even if you are, you may or may not see it. It may or may not have meaning. You're not going to, miss something in the larger story, because these are not, again, they're Easter eggs. They're not key plot points necessarily. So it adds to the richness to me. And that in some cases, it doesn't matter how far down the rabbit hole you are, there's almost always guaranteed to be someone that's further down the rabbit hole.
Well, yeah,
and you're gonna I saw these 5 Easter eggs, but I didn't even realize that was an Easter egg, or I didn't see it and somebody else had to point it out to me. And that's what I love, is that there's just it's like a ongoing Where's Waldo kind of thing.
Well, and it goes towards sort of like you become there's an extension of the relationship a storyteller has with the listener, because we can all go, frog, well, there's a frog, where did that come from, and and that was when I had to rewind, because it just whizzes by it, and I was like, that was something moving there, what was that? And so don't dash my hopes for a Frog Thor movie or series. Come on, let's hope.
Yeah. Oh no. And I mean, and I got to the point too that I was like, every time they had like, whether they're walking a new variant by, you're just doing the whole, like, even that first guy where you're like, okay, oh no, he was just there to show like Loki the importance of why you need your ticket and the consequences. But you start to do that thing where you're looking at like everyone or everything, as far as again, is this an Easter egg or not?
You have,
do they really just have a random person walking down the hallway? How many people are truly random, and how much is it? Oh, wait a second, that's so-and-so from blah, 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 blah.
There's planets, like every planet in there is represented in Marvel Comics. The Lament where they got destroyed. Oshkosh, Wisconsin is a place where one of the things happens. Both that and the planet that gets destroyed by crashing into its own moon are both tie in with a character named Quasar that people might recognize, or maybe he'll show up. There's just
like,
all these,
nothing that's random. Like, as much as they've created different things, and maybe again tweaked into storylines differently. Well, again, they're in the TVA. There's this whole multiverse idea, but it's the idea that it's like, if you needed a story, oh, wait a second, there's this over here. We can, again, they can, not just they're not limited. In the sense that, okay, you can't do anything, you can't create anything new, but at the same time, it's like, oh my God, you got this richness to pull from. Why don't I just bring in this cool thing that I love from, my childhood and reading comics?
So that's a real good segue for, I want to hit here towards the end. Talk about, you already mentioned how you use Loki in your program, and we've talked about your program before, but maybe talk a little more about what you're doing now with that, and how you utilize that as ways for people to see themselves and to heal. What do you?
Well, I can tell you that the first of all, the new website and the membership.
Oh, is it up?
I don't want to jinx myself. Finally, in the home stretch, I was literally like checking out like the back end of it today in terms of pages. But so the program's designed based on the idea that you've heard me say this before. I came to realize that in some respects, Stanley was sort of like my first therapist, in the sense that he gave me all of these characters. Hold on, I'm going to drop my blinds here because I'm just about to go blind with the light coming into the sun has finally come out in Winnipeg.
I saw that. It was coming
and reflecting off the snow into my eyes.
I just I remembered luckily to close my blinds that are right behind my computer, because that'll come in.
Yeah, it was cloudy enough when we started, but so what happens is with the program is that and fell in love with these things, related to different characters. And then when I actually, because again, I was undiagnosed for so long, when I started actually having, positive and supportive therapeutic relationships and started to do things, integrated those tools in. And it was actually later on with my son where I found myself having to help him while he waited for diagnosis. And again, was having a lot of issues around self-esteem, and found myself reframing tools and using movies that we had seen because I was noticing the patterns. And what was interesting was that watching the emergence of, the X-Men movies in the MCU was kind of this interesting pulling stuff back together. So I'd done the cartoons in the 90s with the oldest one, but what I was finding was that this stuff was bringing it back together, but now I was seeing the parallels with the toolkit that I had. And so that's where I started reframing these things. So the Embrace Your Superpowers program is about using characters from Marvel as I guess you say almost like profiles or markers or just even inspiration. So we talked about Spidey, like Spidey senses are like anxiety in terms of your twitchiness, your sensitivity, what they do. I mean, I think of in Civil War where he's bouncing around and there's all the chattiness, and even, watching the early stages of Bucky and Sam bonding over like, who's this teenager? Will somebody just, coach him?
I don't know if you've been in a fight, but there's not this much talking. Oh, just when he's like, there's not usually this much talking in a fight.
Exactly. But that's a classic example of there's the anxious person that doesn't like the silence, and he can't just do the thing. So so Spider-Man has that, performative aspect that in some respects reflects anxiety. And so it's using these different characters as creating a safe space. So again, Loki's used for multiple diagnoses. Wolverine and Captain Marvel are used for complex PTSD and PTSD, so trauma responses. I use Thor to talk about body image and relationships with food. And again, there's still ties to trauma and other things there, but the reflection on that, and even neurodivergence. So like Nightcrawler is, has always been one of my favorite characters. And as somebody with, variable attention stimulus trait, he's my guy.
I hadn't thought about him in a long time.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where using these characters to represent or to be able to discuss how their traits and their characteristics both reflect the challenges that we have with a certain diagnosis, but also literally the superpowers. And I think that's the other part for me. And the nerd in me always gets a little weird when people talk about, oh, blah, blah, blah is my superpower. And I'm like, okay, you're just talking about that thing that you do really well. A superpower always comes with a cost. It's not just a thing that you do well or that you would ever. It's something that pulls you in both directions, and that is either going to, again, if you're brought down the path, led by a Professor X, you're going to get your skills harnessed. It doesn't mean there's going to be less of a challenge, but you're going to train, you're going to be in a supportive environment. Or are you going to go down the Magneto path where, again, you lash out and you do harm to yourself and others? So those are the kinds of metaphors that we use. And it's a way of giving people, either if there's someone with lived experience of a diagnosis, a positive way of reframing how they see themselves, and acquire tools in a way that I have to say, in my own lived experience, sometimes I was given a great tool, but I didn't realize it was a great tool right away because how it was handed to me was like homework, or that I was being should upon. And so this is a way of, it's what I did with my kid, made it engaging, made it fun, made it relatable, made it something where someone, I guess how I put it is, most of the best lessons I've ever learned in life were not external things forced upon me. They were things drawn out of me. And so it creates that environment where you can have those conversations, and the characters are both close enough that they're relatable, but you're also not talking about abstract, either case study type characters, nor are people, compelled to talk about themselves. So you can talk about, so anxiety, you've got a client or a colleague or some from work, and you're worried about, their anxiety disrupting things. Well, what do let's talk about Peter Parker. Well, hold on. Everybody has empathy for Peter Parker. Okay, well, if you can have empathy for Peter Parker or Miles Morales or, Spider-Gwen, then why can't you have think about that when you think about that person. Put them in, pop that character. So it's good for both what I call the superheroes and the allies.
Yeah.
And so, so the program is now going to be going online. So I had been offering it before, doing workshops and keynotes and doing them usually in person. And that was a little bit harder in the pandemic. So a lot of the pandemic has been about taking it and turning it into online content where people will basically, everybody goes through the introductory module, and you go through 8 missions. So everything is about accomplishing a mission. And then that same 8 steps is used in all the subsequent modules that go into either diagnostic in either neurodiversity or mental health. And then there's other things that are larger issues, like looking at how do you create mentally healthy environments, or you can do a module on positive psychology, and again, all run through a superhero framework. So like positive psychology, that's the opportunity to explore Steve Rogers.
Mm-hmm.
And
nice. Yeah.
Well, first Avenger, but he's always that guy that, again, reframes, sees the positive. He knows he's knee deep in stuff. He's not, and again, that whole thing, it's not toxic positivity, it's positive psychology. And there's a difference. He knows he's knee deep in something, but he still will find, okay, what's the way that we can get out of this? And so it's again, taking all of these different tools and delivering them in a way there. So yeah, that was a
cool
run-on sentence. The vast is, taken over.
Well, it's a very powerful perspective. And I love getting it out there. I told you before, I've adopted it a lot in my work with people a lot of times too, of talking about the weakness versus the superpower. And I just think it's really, what is the website? You got to plug it.
It's www.speakup.co. The old one is still up. We're having to move the new one onto the server and tweak a few things, but it's speakup.co.
And it's .co, not .com.
Not .com, no. Yeah. And that's a whole other, I won't get into the backstory around that, but it's .co. and it's speak-up. Again, I wasn't the one that picked the URL when this was being developed, and Speak Up's the larger company. And within that, this is the Embrace Your Superpowers program. And then the other one is the BTS related one, where it's Bulletproof to Stigma. And it runs, again, similar tools through I guess now it's coming up on 9 years of the music and videos and other creative content by Bangtang Soyodan. And again, so there's dabbling into Jungian psychology. There is, again, peer support, their own approach to how they engage. Interestingly enough, some of their songs reflect cognitive behavioral therapy. So I actually just did another presentation at an international conference with a colleague from Brazil. And we talked about, again, their stuff so I do fandom related mental health, and I'm also involved with the Diversely Geek Foundation, which is based out of Florida, and we do fandom related mental health.
Thank you for listening to the Courtemp Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Courtemp Arts shows, visit courtemparts.com.